When that April with his showers soaked, the drought of March hath pierced to the rote, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage. That, of course, is from the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is my edition. I love this book. This tag was created by A.J. Dunn Reads Writes. It's a fantastic tag dealing with fantastic work. I was kindly tagged by Brian over at Bookish, and I'm excited to actually upload this on a day where I am on a pilgrimage of sorts as I head on flight to a conference. Unfortunately, I don't know that my companions will have quite as many delightful or horrifying tales as are in the Canterbury Tales, but this is a great tag. I'll be doing the first half on my flight out, and I'll hopefully be uploading the second half on the day of my flight back. So here we go. Prompt 1. The host is the character who relates the tales to the reader. He is large, loud, and merry. Recommend a mammoth book over 800 pages for March of the Mammoths. The prologue is just a wonderful piece of work. It gives us all sorts of characters very quickly, all these strange little quirks that they have, their personalities. Chaucer illuminates those very quickly. And then he plays on those throughout the Canterbury Tales. But in terms of March of the Mammoths, I've been reading the Baburnama by Babur. This is from the 16th century. Babur was from Central Asia and ultimately would create an empire, but in his earlier years as a young adult, he lost his family's kingdom and citadel city of Samarkand. So there's a strange, beautiful melancholy to it. But he also is sketching all sorts of personalities, his family, his opponents, his allies, as he writes this wonderful, wonderful work. I would add in, of course, the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi if you want something that's a little more fast-paced, perhaps a little more poetic, like the Canterbury Tales. This is both are wonderful works. Prompt 2, the Knight stands for fighting, war, and bravery. The Knight's tale is fairly long, and there's a single subtle allusion that the Knight may not be just this wonderful guy. But anyways, recommend a book with a courageous main character. I think I could do a lot worse than recommending Dana from Octavia E. Butler's Kindred. Not only is she brave, but she's also intelligent, she's resourceful, and she's consistently confronting her worst fears and trying to maintain her dignity and give dignity to others despite real horrors. This is an amazing book as well. Prompt 3, The Wife of Bath. Holy cow. The 20-page prologue of The Wife of Bath is incredible. It's a transcendent prologue. Highly recommend it. The irony is there, whether you're reading it in Middle English or in a Canterbury Tale translation to modern English, whether it's poetic or prose, it's fantastic. I've long been a fan of The Wife of Bath as a personality, not just her tale, but her personality. She stands for marriage, sex, and arguing. And the beauty of her argument is like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She uses all of these great ideas and uses, the scripture to combat her opponents. So she's criticized for having had 5 husbands and should have only married once. And she notes, well, Solomon had all of these husbands, and Jesus, when he talked to that Samaritan woman, noted that she had had 5 husbands and the current one was not her husband. So how many did she have? And she makes note of, there's no mention of bigamy or octogamy or, how many times could I marry? I've been on a pilgrimage 3 times to Jerusalem. So she's a really wonderful personality. Anyways, tell us about a book with a strong female character. It would be the book I most recently finished, Dead Girls by Nekesa Afia. This is a debut novel. The main character, Louise Lloyd, is a closeted 26-year-old in 1920s Harlem, and she's drawn in to help sort of the police officers investigate a serial killer who's murdering young black women there in Harlem. And she has to really find herself, learn how to do things, intuit conversations, and know when to move forward, when to pursue sort of her own tack on the investigations in case. This was a really enjoyable book, and I'll certainly be looking forward to Harlem Sunset. Prompt 4, The Pardoner is all about ambiguity, also nihilism. Tell us about your favorite queer characters. Well, Louise Lloyd could have been a great candidate, but I wanted to reference Patricia Highsmith's The Price of Salt, which is not in this volume. My volume's out on loan. But that is a really, really incredible book because it's one of the earliest representations where queer characters aren't punished at the end, as they so often were across 19th and 20th century works, and whether it was in book or in film. Therese and Carol can have, in a sense, a happy ending. And so that's one that I wanted to highlight. I would be remiss if I did not add as well multiple characters from Marcel Proust in Search of Lost Time, who are just fascinating personalities. There are so many different characters within the work that are queer, that there's a real ensemble there. It's not just this, there's one character who's queer and there's this sense of tokenism, but there are many different characters with different walks of life. I would add a similar work would be Romance in Marseille by Claude McKay, where our characters are just, leading so many different identities in so many different ways that they can love, that it works so well. I would add in two poets who were queer, whose poetry is really where that's exemplified, like their identity as poets, as poetic creators, and as sort of a first person within the poetry they write is astonishing. And that would, of course, be May Swenson, particularly in the uncollected poems, because her published poems often maintained sort of a subtlety in terms of identity, but in her unpublished poems, there are deeply, deeply romantic poems. And then, of course, Shakespeare. His sonnets are fantastic, and they reveal so many different aspects of human romance that are wonderful and amazing. One from a writer who generally did not write women well, and had all sorts of issues, would be the female character in The Sea Change by Ernest Hemingway. Great short story, highly recommend it. It's possibly my favorite short story from Hemingway. Moving forward, The Miller. Now, The Miller's Tale is indeed bold, blasphemous, and he overturns conventions. So The Pardoner's Tale was the first Canterbury Tale I read in school, and I thought it was really interesting. I think I was a junior in high school. I was 16 years old, and so I asked for a copy of the Canterbury Tales, I think for that Christmas when I was 16. And I read the prologue and was amazed by it. I was like, who are all these people? Like, they sound interesting. And then The Knight's Tale was pretty strong, but as I went on, The Miller's Tale I remember reading The Miller's Tale and thinking, like, this is something they were recommending us that we had to read in school? Like, holy cow! It felt so subversive. Who is your favorite naughty character? I don't know that it's my favorite, but one that I recently read was Sagittarius by Ray Russell. Russell wrote a very small number of horror stories, horror novels, and he wrote a sort of Gothic trilogy, Sardonicus, Sagittarius, Sanguinarius. Sagittarius is a really fascinating tale where it deals with Bluebeard, Jack the Ripper, and sort of this young English nobleman who is remembering a time in roughly like 1909 Paris, in the Grand Guignol, and all sorts of interesting things occurring. And there's, of course, this modern killer who's sort of a Jack the Ripper, Bluebeard combination that's Jekyll and Hyde are brought in. So it's very, very effective. Prompt 6, The Prioress is a modest, quiet, and compassionate, also an anti-Semite. Recommend a book you don't hear much about on BookTube. I don't hear much about drama in general on BookTube, but Molière is fantastic. So I was thinking the Misanthrope, also Don Juan, Tartuffe, so many great plays from Molière. Prompt 7, The monk cares little for the rule of work or prayer. If I remember correctly, doesn't he have a bunch of like nice horses in the stable or something? Tell us about an unconventional character. I would like to describe Storm by George R. Stewart, because the main character of Storm is the storm, Hurricane Maria. It's not an incredibly well-written book, but it was an interesting conception. I believe this was written in the early 1940s. And the main character is a storm, and so the chapters are the different days that the hurricane starts to form and is just noticed as this like strange weather phenomenon by a junior meteorologist. Really, almost none of the characters are named. There's the chief, the pilot, the mechanic, the supervisor, like of the roads, things like that. And so what occurs is every day we get sort of how are the different people and different animals interacting with Hurricane Maria. So the main character of the book is the storm. It's a really cool idea. It just isn't executed as well, perhaps. Moving on. Prompt 8, The Friar is all about confession. The friar is also cooler than the monk. Confess to us. Have you read the Bible, Torah, Quran, or other religious texts all the way through? Yes, I've read the Bible multiple times all the way through, which means that I've also read the Torah all the way through and last year I read the Hebrew Bible in the Hebrew Bible's order rather than in the Old Testament order. There's a slightly different order in terms of the way the books are. This is the King James Version. It's not my favorite version. I prefer the New American Standard, but I grew up in the church. I still worship. I'm what you might think of, I'm fairly egalitarian, I would say, or ecumenical, maybe a spiritual humanist. But I very much, am reading the Bible every year. That said, I have also read the Quran. This translation by Tarif Khalidi, I think, is fantastic, and it really captures a lot of the poetry that exists, particularly in the early surahs. So this is a great translation. I would add in, as Brian over at Bookish did, the Tao Te Ching from Lao Tzu, the Analects from Confucius, what I prefer to the Analects, which would be the Mencius. This is wonderful. I've read in full the Bhagavad Gita. Again, this translation from Juan Mascaro is fantastic. And then the Viking Portable World Bible, which has sort of just all sorts of different texts. This is another great anthology as well. Prompt 9, the summoner is lecherous and a drunk who tries to sound more educated than he is. Summoner is a bad dude. His description of the prologue makes him seem like a physical and like emotional monster. He's a bad dude. Tell us about a book that sounded better than it is, Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. I'll be talking about this in another video sometime maybe this month, hopefully. This is a book that in some ways, one of the towering novels of the century. Lowry's masterpiece has a claim to being regarded as one of the 10 most consequential works of fiction produced in the 20th century. Neither of those are true. This book doesn't quite work on numerous levels, but it is an interesting book, and it's one that I think a lot of people hear mentioned, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about whether or not they read it. So I'd be curious if there are big fans of Under the Volcano out there. I'll have a longer video on that coming in the future. Prompt 10, the parson is poor but rich in thought and deed. Isn't he also one of the only ones who has like a prose tale, if I remember, not a poetic tale? Anyways, tell us about a book that gave you more than you expected. The Polish Officer by Alan Furst. This is in his Night Soldiers series, and I believe this is the third book in this series. It might be the best. What I thought I was getting was a spy novel set in Poland during World War II, because it starts with the twin invasion of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union on Poland. And what happens is this Polish intelligence officer is able to escape, and he then is part of the resistance in France. And this book is really, really well crafted. It develops characters and personalities. It's just an excellent piece of fiction and a great spy novel. Prompt 11, the squire stands for youth, beauty, and courting. That's how he's described in the prologue. He's the squire to the knight, by the way. What book did you fall in love with as a youth? That would be Watership Down by Richard Adams. This is my copy. It was the first adult novel I read. And even though this is the Canterbury Tales, it was not that kind of adult novel. It's a book about rabbits and how heroic they are and the community they build. It's very inspiring. Adult novel. Prompt 12, the clerk says little, but his words are wise and morally virtuous. Tell us about a short book that made you a better person. I will mention the Crito, dialogue by Plato, in which Socrates talks about friendship and the ways in which friends support each other, but also, need to hold each other true. So it's a short work, but I think it's a real pearl within the Socratic dialogues. It's often overshadowed by the Apology on one hand and the Phaedo on the other, which are also very strong works, but I think the Crito just really has some value in it. Prompt 13, the man of law upholds justice and knows the laws by heart. What is a book you could not imagine rereading? And not in a good way. It will be Catcher in the Rye by JD Salinger. I can't stand that book. Prompt 26, I'm jumping ahead because I want to tag a few folks for the flight out to Canterbury and a few folks in part 2 for the flight back from Canterbury to Phoenix. Tag some BookTube pilgrims. I'm going to tag Noah. Everyone who reads it must converse. We're all tagging Noah. He's on this caravan. I'm going to tag Jason Harrigan because since he might have read at least some of the Canterbury Tales, and I would love to hear his stories. I'm going to tag Fit to be Read. Maybe we can get some science fiction responses in here. I'll tag L Thinks. I was going to tag Tom at LA Books, but you know, he's such a good pilgrim. He already set out ahead of me. So instead, I will add in bits of lit. Have a great one, everybody. Thanks.